Dialogue with Bill Nelson, bringing you insight into the world of public affairs, from Cape Canaveral to the Persian Gulf, from high deficits to high finance. Dialogue with Bill Nelson, keeping you abreast of what's happening in Florida, in Washington, and around the world.
Hello, welcome to Dialogue with Bill Nelson. I have a treat for you today. We have Senator Jake Garn, Republican of Utah, is our special guest. And of course, Senator Garn is in the news these days. He's going to be the first public official to fly in the Space Shuttle. We are taping this program at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, where Senator Garn is now undergoing his training for a liftoff within a couple of weeks. Senator, it is a privilege to have you. Thank you for being with us on Dialogue.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.
Well, you know, when it was announced by NASA that they had invited you, I was tremendously pleased that someone of your stature could be the first public official, because you not only are a senator, a chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee that oversees NASA, but you're quite an accomplished pilot in your own right. In fact, you have some 10,000 plus hours in the air. Is that correct?
That's true. I grew up with flying. My father was a pilot in World War I.
Terrific.
And he didn't care whether I was a bum or not as long as I was a pilot. So I started flying with him when I was a very young child. He had an airplane in the 1930s, which was rather unusual. Not too many young boys' fathers had airplanes in those days. So from that beginning with my father setting the example, I became a Navy pilot. And when I finished my 4 years of active duty in the Navy, I came back to Salt Lake City. There was no Naval Air Reserve in Salt Lake City, and my love of flying was greater than my loyalty to the Navy, so I transferred over to the Utah Air Guard and spent another 20 years flying various and sundry aircraft in the Guard, retired as a full colonel on April the 1st of 1979. So I continued to fly as an active pilot even the first 5 years that I was in the Senate. And interestingly enough, people talk about the KC-135, the so-called vomit comet down here that is used to go through the parabolas for zero-G. I flew the KC-135s. In fact, that is the aircraft that the Utah Air Guard still has. So it's been an interesting career. The 10,000 hours, unfortunately, the reason there is so much quantity is I'm old enough to have flown a lot of old prop airplanes that were very slow, so that gives you a lot of time when you fly those slow airplanes.
Now, you were active duty in the Navy. What kind of aircraft were you flying there?
In the Navy, I was in anti-submarine patrol.
I see.
And very rarely got over 100 feet off the water. We were down looking for submarines, so this flight in the shuttle is going to be considerably higher than that. But I was trained to search for submarines and destroy them if we ever got involved in a wartime situation. So I flew S-2s, which was an anti-submarine airplane, P-2Vs, which was a land-based combination recip and jet engine airplane, and flew P-5Ms, which was a seaplane, which has long been retired from the active Navy.
As a matter of fact, Senator, you're sort of a quick legend out here at the Johnson Space Center already, because as you mentioned, this simulation of zero gravity in this KC-135, in which I take it that they take you up and then they come over the curve, and at that point you're weightless, and then when you come out you must significantly experience some G's coming out, and you say it's called the vomit comet. The legend is that the senator didn't get sick at all. He might, through about 12 of these, felt a little queasy at some point, but it's quite the experience of most astronauts. They get sick in this, isn't it?
Well, I cheated.
Oh.
When I say I cheated, when I started to feel a little bit queasy, I went back to the cockpit. And as an old pilot, seeing the horizon going up and down, the artificial horizon in the aircraft, the instruments, focusing my eyes was very helpful, to be honest about it. And yet, what is one man's cure is another man's illness, because one of the young men that was a test subject for NASA had been back in zero-G going through whirling chairs and all of that. he came up to the cockpit to see what it was like. And in 2 of the parabolas, he started to get very ill. And he said, oh, I've got to go back. So what was a cure for me made him ill. But I'm sure that comes from your mind and your eyes, your otoliths, semicircular canals, the inner ear, get trained. Having spent all those years in the cockpit, when I say I cheated, I went to where there was some familiar surroundings, something that my eyes would focus on. That's very important in motion sickness, if your eyes focus, sending your brain the proper signals. So maybe it really isn't cheating, but for me, with the pilot background, I sort of thought it was, and I guess the question will never be answered. If I hadn't run up to the cockpit, would I have survived the back of the aircraft?
Well, that's important. So many of our audience today that is watching are the finest launch team in the world. Our audience of Floridians, employees at the Kennedy Space Center, from which you will launch within a few short days. So many of these people, knowing that you're there in the shuttle, it's a matter of pride for them. They're going to thoroughly enjoy this, and I want them to get to know you. Now, you have been in the Senate a number of years. You've achieved the position as chairman. Whatever got you into politics to begin with?
Well, I served a good deal of my time in the Navy in Southeast Asia, and I came back from that experience being very grateful that I was born and grew up in the United States.
Now, about what year was that you came back from Southeast Asia?
In 1960.
I see.
And then I also, during the years in the Guard, had an opportunity to fly into Vietnam, flying cargo into Saigon and Da Nang, places like that. But I felt so very strongly after seeing the incredible poverty, the horrors of war, and the way people lived over there, the lack of freedom and opportunity that they had. I didn't intend to run for public office, but I did intend to be an active, involved citizen. So when I came home in 1960, I got involved in a congressional campaign. Former Congressman Sherm Lloyd was running for Congress that year, and I became chairman of his 21 to 35 campaign committee. And I was in Junior Chamber of Commerce and eventually joined Kiwanis and in the cancer drives and things of that nature. I was simply an active, involved citizen who was in the insurance business, had no intentions of running myself, but helping others. And in 1967, I don't know how I got talked into it, but I got talked into running for the Salt Lake City Commission and surprised myself and everyone else by defeating an incumbent who had been in city government for more than 30 years. Became very discouraged with the way the city was being run and decided, well, the only way I can change this is I need to be mayor. I can't do it as a city commissioner. So I was elected mayor of Salt Lake City, served one term, and then was elected to the Senate in 1974. So my political career was never by design. It sort of evolved from my participation as a citizen. And so I have been in the Senate for the last 10 years.
Now, was it your love of flying that propelled you when you got on the Appropriations Committee to want to go into the area that handles NASA? Or did you have a first instinct that you wanted to go in and do defense appropriations?
Well, actually, my involvement with NASA started much earlier, because in January of 1975, when I was given my first committee assignments, there was still a separate space committee, a full committee, not just a subcommittee, for NASA. And I was put on that committee, so I served when Jim Fletcher was the administrator of NASA. So I was immediately involved with NASA at the time on their authorizing committee when I came to the Senate in January of 1975. So when I got on the Appropriations Committee a couple of years later, there were 2 specific subcommittees that I wanted to be on. One of them was Defense Appropriations, because I had to give up the Armed Services Committee to move to Appropriations. And the other one was HUD and independent agencies. And there were 2 reasons that I wanted to go there. One was NASA, to continue my space activities. The other was HUD, because I have housing authorization as chairman of the Banking Committee. At that time, I was not chairman, but I wanted to be on both authorizing and appropriations for the housing programs. So my committee assignments are just exactly what I would like. I've been very fortunate to be able to be on just the committees I would pick if they said, what do you want to be on, Jake Garn? And I'm on those committees.
And I would echo that. I am so privileged to recently have been elected chairman of the Space Subcommittee in the House. And it is a tremendous thrill and excitement for me now to be able to lead this force in the House in this area that has so much promise for the future. Americans' presence in space, the exploration that we will have in the future, the manufacturing, the industrialization, the fact of perhaps the purity of drugs that we will manufacture in space, no telling what we can do to the dread diseases that we find on the planet Earth. It's an honor, and I know you feel the same way. I remember hearing a story about your relationship with your dad and how much you were so interested in flying because of him and his constant example to you, and how now the fulfillment of your dreams to be able to fly in the Space Shuttle, you look back, is going to be such a reward for those early years of what your father meant to you as a boy. Share some of that with us.
Well, that's true, and despite my oversight responsibilities and what I'm learning, I'd be less than candid with the American people if I didn't say I am just incredibly excited about going from a personal standpoint. It's sort of a Walter Mitty dream come true. But I can remember sitting with my father watching TV when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And my father started to cry, and I thought, gee, what's this to cry about? It's exciting. I said, what's wrong, Dad? Is there something terribly wrong? And he said, no. He said, I'm just overcome with the emotion of watching men from the face of the moon. And he said, here I am watching it with my son. And when I was 10 years old, I sat with my father, and he read me the Salt Lake newspaper about the Wright brothers' first flight. So when you talk about what's going to happen in development in the future, I think it's beyond our wildest expectations, because in my father's lifetime, from the time he was 10 years old until he was 76, he witnessed the Wright brothers' first flight by media, and then he witnessed men walking on the moon in a period of 66 years. When I think what my children and grandchildren will be seeing 50 years down the road, we're in the infancy of space travel, and yet the spin-offs from the space program already have been incredible. Things that we use every day that benefit us in our daily lives have been developed because of our space efforts. And I get angry when I hear people come up and say, well, why are we wasting money in space? Why aren't we spending it here on Earth? My first answer is, we've never spent a dime in space. Every bit of NASA's budget is spent here on Earth.
Precisely.
But then you start looking at the $6 or $7 return for every tax dollar spent in products that we use every day, and as you so eloquently said, that is going to accelerate even more rapidly in the future.
The fact that a program like the Apollo program, which was so successful in what it symbolized, that we went to the moon and back, and yet it affects our everyday lives, the pacemakers, the microscopic surgery now, the calculators on your watch, and so forth, the Teflon, the household appliances, some of the fabrics that we wear, all are a spin-off of the space program. And so the sky is the limit, as it's said. We're talking with Senator Jake Garn, Republican of Utah, chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate that handles NASA. And of course, you folks know Senator Garn, especially the fact that he is the first public official to be selected by the United States to fly in the Space Shuttle, a mission that will be coming up within a few days. Senator, you know, there are some people, notably folks like the New York Times, that have taken exception to the fact that you have been chosen. They've had some harsh criticism. I don't hear much of that, by the way. I want to tell you, around the Cape, most folks in the area of Florida are generally enthusiastic. There are some, however, that, as folks like the New York Times say that they think this is the ultimate junket. Now, I know that you've been given a specific task by NASA. You're a payload mission specialist. Share with us some of the things that you're going to be doing on this flight.
Well, first let me say that overwhelmingly across the country there is support. There are pockets of nasty opposition like the New York Times. I just consider the source to begin with.
Sure.
And it's interesting that many of the critical press, when I have said, well, would you like to go? And they said, of course. So a lot of it is jealousy. There's a double standard involved here that they think the press should go, but a politician should not. I think the press ought to go someday. I don't think there's any doubt about that, that somebody that is a skilled writer and can communicate those feelings back to people on Earth will be very helpful to the space program in the future. But I told NASA that I didn't want to go just as chairman, that I didn't want to go just as an observer and to sit up there and watch. And I would be willing to go as a experiment. I made that comment 3 or 4 years ago. They've taken me up on my offer. One of the very difficult things that has faced space flight is space motion sickness. And it is very different than motion sickness caused on Earth. There are a lot of pieces of the puzzle of space motion sickness that have not been solved. They don't know why the otolith and the semicircular canals send different signals to the brain and why they're confusing signals. And I think there's an opportunity with me going, where I'm not involved in the deployment of the satellites, to do some testing that the other crew members on previous shuttle flights simply have not had the time to do, because as my commander said, a year from now they won't remember whether you got sick or whether you took your blood pressure or had an EEG. They'll remember whether I got those satellites deployed properly. And he's right.
Sure.
So this does have to be secondary to the primary mission of the shuttle. So I can do a series of medical experiments in space that hopefully will provide some of the pieces of that puzzle to solving the space motion sickness problem for the future, particularly for longer missions, without being encumbered by having to be involved with deploying those satellites. Some of the things I'm going to be doing are firsts, have not been done in space before. Some of them are repeats about what Dr. Bill Thornton did and others, but I will be able to do them earlier in the flight. Some of the devices worn on launch where they were too busy as crew members to do. So I'm looking forward to it, and I sincerely believe I can contribute some of the pieces of that medical puzzle.
And Dr. Bill Thornton, one of our physician astronauts that you spoke of that flew, a year or so ago, if I recall, he was around age 53, 54 when he flew. You're age 52?
52.
You are an excellent specimen of good health. Tell us, what do you do to keep in condition? You run every day, don't you, Senator?
I run every day. I run at least 25 to 30 miles per week. But I decided years ago, when I was in my 30s, and I would look at people in their 40s and 50s and say, I simply will never look like that. I refuse to be fat and middle-aged. So I've always kept myself in good shape. But a couple of years ago, when I thought I might have a chance to go on the shuttle, I even increased that activity to get in even better shape than I had been before. So I've succeeded in getting my resting pulse rate down to about 45. My blood pressure is very good. And I haven't been in this good a shape since I was in Navy flight training about 30 years ago.
Plus, you're certainly up psychologically for what all's about to take place, and I think it's exciting for you. Thank you for joining us on Dialogue with Bill Nelson. Our guest is Senator Jake Garn, the first public official that will fly in the Space Shuttle. And we're delighted to have him in discussing a number of the issues concerning this first flight. Now, Senator, in some of this criticism, you know that they have said, people like the New York Times, that, well, since you help control the purse strings for NASA, that by NASA doing this, selecting you, it's a self-serving kind of thing for NASA. They're going to give you this tremendous joyride, and therefore you will then come back and let the purse strings loose so that the money will flow better to NASA. How do you counter those charges?
They can't have it both ways. They can't, on the one hand, say to you and I as members of Congress, when something happens in an agency, why didn't you know that?
Sure.
Why weren't you exercising your oversight responsibilities? I flew the B-1 years ago to decide whether that was something that I ought to vote for or not. I've driven the M1 tank. I've gone to Veterans Administration hospitals to look at their construction problems. That's part of yours and my responsibility. Not just to pass new laws, but to make certain that the ones we have already passed work, to look at the funding that has already been approved, seeing that it is being spent as efficiently as possible. And so this is spectacular. That's why they're after it. They don't criticize the B-1 flight. They don't criticize the Veterans Administration hospital visit. They don't criticize where I have EPA under my jurisdiction. I go look at a toxic waste dump. This is new, it's exciting, and I understand that. But it is part of my oversight responsibilities. And already, Congressman, it's just really been a revelation to me after years of looking at NASA's budget to be here on site, not as chairman of their Senate Appropriations Committee, but as a payload specialist, going to classes by myself in informal clothes like the other astronauts, working with all of the training people, given me a far, far better insight into NASA than just listening to the testimony in the hearings year after year as I've done so. And there's something else that needs to be said. The astronauts get all the publicity. The public sees that shuttle launch, and they will see it in a few days, and they will see it come back. What they don't see is the incredible support teams that go on in NASA that make it possible for that shuttle. The people in the background that are never heard of, whether it's the people that prepare the food, whether it's those who prepare the equipment, whether it's those who put the tiles back on, but there is an incredible support team in various divisions that make that shuttle possible, and I didn't realize that as much myself. They deserve as much credit as those of us who are going to ride at the end of that process.
I think a point to underscore about Senator Garn being the first public official, when compared, for example, that NASA is going to be, through the selection process, will ultimately choose a teacher that will fly in space. Ultimately, there'll be a journalist, there'll be an artist. It may be a spoken artist, it may be a written artist, it may be a writer, etc. The fact is that this transportation system is going to allow us to have a number of varied experiences. But those folks that will be selected in the future, such as the writer and the teacher and the professor, the artist, they are not a part of the NASA program. They're not a part of the government. You are. Charlie Walker, although he's employed by a contractor, he was actually an astronaut that was there as a mission specialist because he was the expert on that particular experiment, the electrophoresis. Is that a good way to look at it?
Well, it is. You know, some of the news media have made a point trying to say the president has broken his first campaign promise, that the teacher was supposed to be the first private citizen to go. That teacher will still be the first private citizen to go. I am not a private citizen. I'm a public official with responsibility for NASA's budget. That teacher is not connected with NASA, not connected with the Air Force, the Navy, is not connected with a foreign government. That the president will keep his promise. That is an entirely different category. That teacher will be the first private citizen to go into space.
Well, one of the results of this, I would think, Senator, is the fact that you will have enormous credibility upon your return to be visionary, to look into the future, to see where the nation's space effort ought to be going. Now, we are embarked upon a new and exciting challenge as a result of the President's commitment of building a manned space station in the early 1990s. And all of the outgrowths from that, the possibility of going back to the moon, the possibility of going in a manned mission to Mars, the scientific experiments that can be conducted right there on the space station, using the space station as a launching point into the heavens for further science experience. With your new credibility, as you come back, having been there, having put your life on the line, risking your life there.
George Washington Parkway is more dangerous than
Well, I guess so, at about 8:30 in the morning. That perhaps is true. Where do you see your role now in the future to help lead the nation's space effort? To bring some coordination to the nation's space program?
You're right. The next step is that space station. And you and I and other members of Congress have a responsibility to see how that progresses. Congressman Bolendie, my counterpart on the House side on the Appropriations Committee, have been deeply involved in what kind of a space station do we want? What is the mix between robotics, automation, and man-tended type space stations? Those are key decisions of which the Space Shuttle is a part. A lot of people don't realize STS means Space Transportation System. The shuttle is an integral part of that development, taking people, equipment, experiments back and forth to the space station, and then to be able to go on with the other activities you've talked about from that station. And I would hope that coming back, I don't expect to be visionary or anything like that, but I do expect to have some very detailed knowledge of how this space transportation system works. And I would hope my colleagues would call on me for my opinion coming from actual experience rather than from listening to testimony. I think that's true having been a mayor. A lot of my colleagues say, hey Jake, what about this program? What about that? I was on the other end. I was on the bottom end of that funnel coming from Washington. It wasn't theoretical. I knew how they worked. This gives me that same opportunity not to say, well, this is how I think it works. This is how I know it works because I have had actual experience. And I really sincerely believe that will be helpful to me and my other colleagues to share that in how we develop this process through the space station and on into outer space.
Well, we're talking with Senator Jake Garn, chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee in the United States Senate that oversees NASA, many other agencies of government. Most prominently now, we all will be glued to our television sets. Those of us who are not at the Kennedy Space Center, as I will be, they are cheering you on as the Space Shuttle rises into the heavens. And so, Senator Jake Garn, you have honored us with your presence here on Dialogue with Bill Nelson. We wish you Godspeed, the best of luck, and God bless you. And thank you for joining us on Dialogue.